this commander in New York, where he showed us these drone images of how they were fighting building to building. And he even said, often they found themselves fighting within the same building. And so it's not even street fighting. There's no front line there. Essentially, they're almost so mixed up. It means you can't really use artillery there, because you can't use it for the for the simple reason you might catch your own people with your artillery. So that is pretty brutal fighting. And I think the army chief in Ukraine he called the fighting there exceptionally brutal. But they were literally talking about that not being able to find these people that they're fighting against, even knowing that they're right there, and then discovering that they were in a basement and actually setting fire to tires to smoke them out the basement so that they could then engage them in fighting. I mean, this is very close combat.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are joined by World Affairs editor Catherine Philp. In her almost 25 years at the time, she's reported from conflicts in Afghanistan to Colombia and more recently Ukraine, where she can update us on her latest reporting trip. Catherine, good to see you again. Thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you about those reporting trips inside Kursk region in Russia and along the front line in the Donbass in Ukraine in a moment. But before that, I just wanted to ask you your insight, really, because this week we've had some particularly harrowing aerial attacks on Ukraine, on Lviv, killing 7, including a woman and her 3 children, straight after Russia's deadliest single bombardment on a military institute on the city of Poltava. I mean, that killed more than 50 people. And there have been several attacks on cities throughout and towns throughout Ukraine. What effect is that having on the Ukrainians that you have met?
Yeah. Hi, Kate. Well, I think what was happening in the run up to those attacks, so the background to it really was that there was a huge surge of a morale boost from this operation into Kursk, where Ukraine sort of really got to take the initiative militarily for once and launch this attack into Russian soil, which obviously is pretty embarrassing for the Russians that they couldn't stop that happening. So that gave a morale boost, I think, to the population as well as the soldiers. It's been followed, unfortunately, by some pretty bad news about how things are going in the Donbass, because it was hoped that one of the objectives of that Kursk operation would be to draw Russian troops away from where the most intense fighting is happening, and that hasn't happened. So there was already perhaps a sort of a slight loss of euphoria after that, and I think the bombings came on top of that, a bit of a kind of another blow, another shock. And the Poltava bombing, despite being the biggest of I think the year, it was a military target, and I think that lands differently. I think the one in Lviv was actually just as shocking, because it obviously was in a place that it doesn't often get hit, is seen as in the safe zone of Ukraine, and also, of course, involves civilians, a woman and her children.
And as you say, this comes at a crucial time. President Putin wants to take the whole of the Donbass. President Zelensky wants to continue to occupy the ground taken inside Russia, and both continue to trade blows on each other's energy infrastructure and facilities. You recently went to Pokrovsk. What was your assessment of the Russian advance at that time and since?
That it was moving incredibly quickly, and much more quickly than anyone had predicted. That it actually seemed to accelerate after the Kursk operation. Now, President Zelensky has denied that, but the facts on the ground tell a different story. That places, the settlements on the approach to Pokrovsk have fallen faster than we might have expected. I spoke to soldiers on the ground there who were complaining about the kind of command decisions they were getting, the kind of orders being handed down that they couldn't make sense of. They don't think that that they are fighting in the right way. There's a lot of troops being recently scrambled from other fronts. So, excuse me, I was speaking to a commander from the Azov Brigade, who obviously are very skilled long-term fighters and are held in some reverence in Ukraine. They were sent 2 weeks after the Kursk operation happened, and clearly because of that advance happening. Now, they were saying, we've kind of been thrown into this battlefield with people that we don't know. We haven't fought alongside. There's no divisional command. So, for example, this commander sent there, he doesn't know the caliber of the soldiers he's dealing with. He doesn't know what they're capable of, and that makes it very difficult to lead a command on a defense on the approach to Pokrovsk. But one thing that they did talk about a lot was the sheer numbers that the Russians have and the way that they fight, so that they send in these small units almost on suicide missions that tie up the Ukrainians within that sector of the battlefield, and then they can advance elsewhere. And they described it to me as suicidal, but something that, and how do they persuade the soldiers to do this? I mean, in some cases, they said that there were a lot of convicts fighting in that area, which is a bit like what we had in Bakhmut, but they said that the tactics being used were very different, because they're really advancing on a broader front line, and they've kind of got the initiative along that whole front line.
And when you talk about those kind of tactics, what kind of challenges are they presenting to the Ukrainian troops?
I mean, they are very, very aware that there are fewer of them. That they are, they just say that we kill far more of them than they get of us. Although there are losses on both sides, they said that the Russians are losing many more men, but it just doesn't seem to make an enormous difference to what's going on the ground. And I think that that's bewildering and frustrating. I was speaking to a guy who was leading the battle in a place improbably called New York, which is sort of it's actually sort of further back than the advance on Pokrovsk. So the vanguard of the advance on Pokrovsk sort of looks like an arrow, and they're back here. And he would like to cut off that salient, go behind the Russians, but the orders they're getting from higher up make that impossible for them.
It's interesting. I was just thinking about what you were saying earlier about how the advance had accelerated, and you had. I mean, it really. It almost seems like you've got two tales of what's actually happening in that area. On one hand, you hear it's a very slow, grinding advance by the Russians. Then you're telling me the extreme opposite.
It has been a slow grinding advance for some time. So what happened was that in February there was a place called Avdiivka that the Ukrainians had to give up because they couldn't hold it, and that was really a direct consequence of the delay in ammunition reaching them because of politics in Washington. So what was going on in Congress, where they were trying to tie together the Israel aid, but then you had the senators who are sort of more pro-Russian, I suppose, or more sympathetic to the Russian idea of settling this and having negotiations. So when that happened, this is really this is sort of the tail end of that battle, or it's the next stage of that battle. And that part of the fight was very grinding. What has happened in this one is that the Russians have sped up.
Mm. And you were mentioning there about some of the complaints that you've been hearing. What is the morale like of the Ukrainian forces that you met?
It was strong in the Kursk operation and much lower in the Donbass. I mean, most of it was coming at the soldiers themselves, I feel, are sort of doing what they can on the ground, but there is their expressions of discontent were with the command and the way that the battle's being fought on, a number of levels.
Yeah, and how intense is the fight? The soldiers that you met in the Donbass. How intense is the fighting there?
Is extremely intense. I mean, I think one of the most extraordinary examples was, again, this commander in New York, where he showed us these drone images of how they were fighting building to building. And he even said, often they found themselves fighting within the same building. And so it's not even street fighting. There's no front line there. Essentially, they're almost so mixed up. It means you can't really use artillery there, because you can't use it for the simple reason you might catch your own people with your artillery. So that is pretty brutal fighting, and I think the army chief in Ukraine he called the fighting there exceptionally brutal. But they were literally talking about that not being able to find these people that they're fighting against, even knowing that they're right there, and then discovering that they were in a basement and actually setting fire to tires to smoke them out the basement so that they could then engage them in fighting. I mean, this is very close combat, and that's yeah, pretty intense stuff.
And you mentioned a little bit about the way they were feeling about what they were having to contend with, given what's going on with the Kursk operation. I mean, did they say what they thought overall about the Kursk operation?
Yeah, I mean, there were mixed views on that. Some people think it's had much of more of an impact than others do. Um, there were some who thought it was just a stupid idea. That was probably a minority view. I think a lot of people saw that there was a political narrative that the Kursk operation had changed, and that that could be as influential as the military actual sort of battlefield maneuvers. But one commander did say to me that, okay, they did it, now what? Did they actually make a plan? How far are they going to go? And his view of it was, now that having done it, they had an enormous number of soldiers up there just fighting to hold the positions, and they're throwing ammunition that they feel that could be better used in Donbass. So they're throwing artillery and brigades at holding this. His view was, you should just mine it all and get out, because you won't be able to hold it.
And while you were waiting to go into Russia, into Kursk Oblast, you were in Sumy, and you had the opportunity before you went in to meet some of the Ukrainian troops who've been injured in that operation. Can you tell me what they told you coming out?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, they talked about when they'd first gone in, how little resistance they met, and that was pretty interesting. How far they've been able to go, like several days before there was any real fighting taking place. These were people who are lightly injured. I would go to the hospital and just sort of hang around out front and wait for people to come out to have a cigarette, and that's quite often the best way to get an unmediated version. So there's no one around listening to what they're saying, you're getting what they really think. What I noticed over the course of days was that they started to talk about it getting much more difficult. And so I think the final time I went, before, so some people had come from Donbass originally, and they described that they said it was like a vacation, it was like a holiday, the change, because it had been so easy to go in. As time wore on, and maybe the last time before I actually went into Kursk, they were talking about a much harder battle, and with the Russians actually starting to push them back, which I don't think we've heard of much of from Kyiv itself, but they were very clear that the Russians were actually retaking positions from them.
Okay, can you tell me a bit more then about your time in Kursk?
Yeah, so my time in Kursk really was within within the town of Suja and some of the villages that were sort of closer to the border. So what I was able to do there, given I had spoken a lot to the soldiers who'd been in there, what was interesting was to speak to the Russian civilians themselves. And, despite the fact that they had been living so close to the Ukrainian border, they really felt that the war there had absolutely nothing to do with them. It wasn't, something that impacted their lives, because that was a quiet part of the border. And that is one of the reasons I think the Ukrainians picked that place to go, because there wasn't much of a military presence there. So really, the overwhelming, impression I got from them was one that they're still in shock that this has happened. They couldn't quite believe it. In the Ukrainian troops themselves seem to be going out of their way to present a sort of benevolent face of what they insisted was a very temporary occupation. And so they were they were bringing supplies for Ukrainian civilians. They had a doctor there that people could go and see. And they said, quite explicitly, that they aimed to show the Russians that they were not behaving the way the Russian troops had behaved when they were occupying swathes of Ukraine in the early days of the invasion.
And when you say, and you've written about it, about the Russians you met, never thinking that their lives would be affected by the war in Ukraine, in spite of the fact they were so close to Ukraine, did you ever get a sense of whether they actually bought into the way President Putin presents the war inside Russia?
Hmm. Well, you've got to understand that these are the people who were stuck there, left there. They're not, the cream of society, to put it mildly. So, these weren't necessarily the most sort of thinking or aware people. A lot of them were old or disabled. Some of them were palpably alcoholics, and they were people who just got stuck there because there was no evacuation whatsoever, and people had to leave under their own steam. So I will just say that to start with. A lot of people insisted to me that they just didn't know anything, that they didn't watch the news. Now, I have no way of knowing if that's true or not, or whether they just didn't want to commit to an opinion. Some people, a couple of people, can actually, sorry, one man condemned Putin by name. Other people said, war is never a good thing. It doesn't bring anything good for others. But then there was a lot of simply saying, we have nothing to do with politics. We're simple people. There was one woman who pushed back quite strongly when she was being shown by Ukrainian soldiers these like videos of interviews with Ukrainians who'd been under Russian occupation, and some of the, damage and some of the things that had been done to them either in bombardment or under occupation. And she really didn't want to hear that. She kept saying, well, we have that in Russia too. When there was footage of damage shown, she would say, well, the Ukrainians are shelling Belgorod too. And then footage came up of the disinterment of mass graves in Bucha. And I said to her, do you have mass graves in Belgorod too? She conceded they did not.
Hmm. And those people that you met, some of them had contacts or had friends and family in Ukraine itself. How did they view the situation now and the fact that they cannot see those people? How did they view the future relationships with those people?
Yeah, well, I mean, they haven't been able to see those people since the war began. That's what was, a reasonably open border, and people would go either way. Apparently, Ukrainian dairy products are better, so the Russians told me. So they would come out across to Sumy Oblast to buy them there. So there was two-way traffic, and some of them had studied in those places. So they haven't seen those people for 2.5 years, and some people spoke of their regrets about that. Their solution to that is not one that would gain much currency in Ukraine, because those who wanted to see, things restored to normal and ordinary relations with the Ukrainians wanted to do so under the framework of a revived Soviet Union. Um, and that is obviously not what is wanted on the Ukrainian side of the border. So, I mean, I think there was this, it was almost the attitude of a much larger neighbor to the smaller neighbor. Oh, we make peace by, you just sort of coming back under our control and it will be fine. Yeah, that's definitely not the attitude in Ukraine, and it's not something I see happening.
And when you were there were hundreds of Russian soldiers who had been captured, among them young conscripts, also Chechen fighters. And you mentioned that when you were talking in Sumy to Ukrainian forces who'd been lightly injured, they told you that the counteroffensive was starting to take hold in Sumy by the Russians. I mean, how much evidence was there at the time that you were there that was on the cards, and what can you tell us about that at the moment?
I mean, I think they will certainly take back. I mean, from what's been happening since I left there, they were starting to sort of nibble back parts of the area that the Ukrainian forces had taken. It probably won't be that fast. It probably won't move as fast as things are moving in the Donbass, simply for the reason that Putin has clearly decided that, as a stated objective is to take Donbass. And that was a downgraded objective when Russia failed to march on Kyiv and take it in totality. He seems to have decided that he can tolerate the presence of Ukrainian troops on Russian soil more than he can afford to undermine the battle in the Donbass. So that's, that was a gamble that has not paid off for Ukraine either, that those troops have not been moved from the Donbass. It does mean that it could take Russia much longer to try and claw back that area.
When you come away from this particular trip and you've been to those two extremely different areas, what do you take with you? How do you assess it?
I mean, I assess them both as incredibly dynamic. The fact that things could change quite quickly, like within the space of a week, soldiers in Kursk were telling me it was like a holiday, to people reporting extremely, intense fighting, and the loss of, actually, I think that one of the things we're not hearing about is how many Ukrainian troops are being lost in Kursk, and that may be a factor that plays into the future judgment of whether it was a good idea or not. So right towards the end of the Kursk operation, they were telling me about quite considerable losses in those particular areas. In Donbass, it was starting to feel inevitable that Pokrovsk would fall. Even at the political level, like high up in Kyiv, there were various MPs were visiting there and saying that they'd seen, parts of the front line that just did not appear to be defended. I was in the city as civilians were packing up and leaving. That there'd been a mandatory order for children and their parents to leave, and then we were sort of, again, down to this. Those people who have to make that decision about whether they're going to leave or whether they're going to try and stay. And remarkably, after you think of the brutality of the Russian occupation elsewhere, there were people who said they were going to stay, and that they feel like they have nowhere to go anymore. And I think certainly that given they were so different, Kursk, there was a sense of euphoria, and then Pokrovsk really sort of brings you back to kind of the fatigue about this war and the fact that people really wonder how much longer can this go on.
And President Zelensky is due to head to the US this month to present his victory plan to Joe Biden. When you talked to ordinary Ukrainians there and soldiers fighting, what do they tell you about how they see the war ending?
It's interesting. We don't talk about that as much as I think we used to in previous trips, and maybe that's just the questions I ask them, because it how you see it ending. There's definitely more people who will talk about negotiations, but I don't think there isn't much appetite to give up territory. But I think that there was a time when nobody wanted to talk about negotiations. Just the mere idea of speaking to President Putin was off the table. I think that there's more appetite for that now. I think it's worth asking what's going to be in this victory plan that Zelensky's going to advance, and I suspect it's going to, if I think of what you could possibly change about the battlefield, I expect he's going to go very heavy on this demand that Ukraine be allowed to use the long-range weapons within Russia and sort of have its hands untied, because it is very clear, if you kind of look at where this bombardment of Ukraine is coming from, especially on civilian targets, it's from airfields that are within range of those long-range weapons, if Ukraine would be allowed to use them. So I think that that's going to be a huge part of that message.
And just finally, Catherine, I'm just wondering, you've mentioned a few things that aren't talked about very much from this trip. Are there any other insights that you've come away with that you'd like to share?
I think the sense of fatigue. I think that what was, I arrived just after Kursk began, so that, kind of morale boost was still there. And then when it kind of dissipated, and when you go and look at the Donbass again, you realize that actually that level of fatigue was probably where a lot of the country was before Kursk. So it was, you were seeing it possibly come kind of back to normal. And I think that, I think when you consider like how many people have left Ukraine, for example, and how many of those people will they ever go back? Those were some of the things I was thinking about as these stories were moving very fast. People left and thought that they were going temporarily. And I think there are now questions. There's demographic challenges in Ukraine, for sure. There's the fact that, because of mobilization orders for men who've stayed in Ukraine, which is most of them because they couldn't get out, they haven't been out of the country for 2.5 years. And it's how long that state of, that war footing can continue in Ukraine without sort of dragging down everything about its economy, development and society.
Catherine Philp, it's been good talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.